Hey there, and welcome back. If you're here, it's probably been a long day. Maybe your mind's still racing, replaying 100 little things you don't need to be thinking about right now. So tonight, let's slow all of that down. Get comfortable, dim the lights, pull the blanket up. For the next hour, I'm going to read you a mix of cozy, calming, and quietly satisfying stories. Some written in the style of the strange and wonderful corners of Reddit, and a couple set deep inside the blocky, torchlit world of Minecraft. No jump scares, no cliffhangers, nothing that's going to keep your brain working overtime. Just slow, easy storytelling meant to drift you off, one sentence at a time. My voice will get slower as we go. That's on purpose. If you fall asleep before the end, good. That means it's working. So settle in, let your eyes get heavy, and let's begin. Story 1: The Midnight Signal in Blackwood Valley. I spent 3 consecutive seasons working as an overnight firewatch observer and trail steward in an isolated valley along the Northern California border. When you live stationed over 40 miles away from the nearest paved 2-lane state route, the concept of silence changes entirely. True quiet is never an absolute absence of sound. It is a tapestry of subtle, textured rhythms that you only begin to recognize after weeks of solitude. You learn to tell the difference between the dry wind scraping through the upper branches of sugar pines and the heavy, moisture laden breeze that rolls off the Pacific ridges just before dusk. You memorize the distinct creak of the 70-foot wooden observation tower swaying gently in a crosswind, the low, steady hum of the solar inverter beneath the floorboards, and the dry, rhythmic click of the battery terminal keeping time like a mechanical heart. During my second year, toward the final weeks of October, a slow moving atmospheric river settled over the mountain basin. For 4 straight days, the sun never managed to break through the canopy of iron gray clouds. A steady, uninterrupted rain soaked the forest floor, releasing a rich, grounding perfume of damp cedar needles, wet granite, and rich, black earth. The humidity hung thick in the valleys, creating a world rendered entirely in shades of slate and forest green. By the third night of the storm, the power lines running through the lower canyon succumbed to a fallen fir tree, cutting the valley off from the main utility grid. Up in the lookout cab, the lights blinked out with a faint buzz, leaving me in the gentle, warm glow of the kerosene lantern I kept on the cedar map table. The primary shortwave radio console, wired to an external auxiliary battery, remained alive, but the emergency channels were empty. Without line of sight relays functioning across the storm cloaked peaks, the receiver settled into a wide, soft ocean of white noise, a sound that closely mirrored the endless rhythm of rain tapping against the glass panes surrounding my room. Around 2:45 in the morning, the analog dial on the receiver gave a soft, distinct mechanical click. It was not the jarring chirp of an emergency dispatch relay or the sudden static spike of lightning striking a ridge. Instead, rising gently through the soft hiss of the atmospheric noise, came the clear, unhurried resonance of a finger picked acoustic guitar. The melody was slow, melodic, and unpolished, played on worn steel strings that carried a deep, warm tone. A few moments later, the guitar drifted into the background, and a voice came through the speaker. It was deep, calm, and textured with age, carrying the natural cadences of someone who spent more time listening to the forest than talking to people. "Good evening, Valley Watchers," the voice spoke softly, speaking into the microphone with a calm, conversational warmth. "The time is currently 2:48 a.m. The barometric pressure at the ridge crest sits steady at 29.82 inches. We have a continuous northern drift, 6 miles per hour, carrying a light mist through the upper tree lines. The water level at the East Fork Spillway is holding clean at 14 feet, well within the safety margins for the seasonal run." I sat completely still in my wool lined armchair, holding a warm mug of black tea, listening intently. What caught my attention was not merely the presence of a broadcast on an inactive frequency, but the specific details being read. The East Fork Spillway had been decommissioned and dismantled in the late 1980s when the Regional Water Authority redirected the basin's runoff into a modern conservation reservoir. The stations and markers the speaker was naming, Lookout Peak 3, the Old Mill Siding, the Clearwater Timber Camp, were landmarks that had long vanished from current operational maps, surviving only as historical footnotes in the leather bound survey logs resting on my lower bookshelf. The broadcast continued without any sense of urgency. The narrator paused between sentences, letting the sound of the rain outside fill the empty spaces, occasionally turning what sounded like physical paper pages in front of his microphone. He spoke of the migration of Roosevelt elk moving down into the sheltered creek beds to avoid the ridge winds, noted the temperature drops across 4 distinct elevations, and mentioned that the wood stove in the cabin was drawing well, throwing a steady heat against the autumn chill. There was no sense of mystery that required solving, no underlying danger or eerie intent. It felt entirely like an old friend checking in from across the mountain, simply cataloging the natural world as it breathed through the storm. I had the hand microphone sitting inches from my fingers. I could have keyed the transmitter and asked who was broadcasting on an abandoned civil forestry channel. Yet doing so felt like it would disrupt something delicate and timeless. Instead, I leaned back against the cushions, watching the amber light of the lantern flicker against the condensation on the windows. Outside, the great pines swayed slowly in the dark, their silhouettes barely visible against the misty gray of the night sky. The calm voice provided 5 more minutes of weather observations, gave a quiet sign off wishing all listeners a restful night and safe travels through the valley trails, and faded seamlessly back into the soft acoustic guitar. When the last chord resonated and decayed, the frequency dissolved back into the steady, peaceful white noise of the rain. When morning finally arrived, bringing with it a pale, cold sunlight that filtered through the damp branches, I radioed the regional dispatch office down in the lowlands. They confirmed that no emergency transmissions, test broadcasts, or forestry dispatches had been sent over the mountain band all night. The airwaves had officially been silent. Yet, for me, that storm night became a sanctuary. To this day, whenever autumn rain sets in and the weather turns cold, I find myself thinking of that quiet voice on the frequency, a gentle reminder that somewhere out in the great expanse of the wild, the world continues its slow, steady cycle, unbothered by time. Story 2: The House Built on the 1920s Orchard. When my partner and I purchased our home in the Hudson Valley of upstate New York, we were drawn primarily to the quiet solitude of the surrounding landscape. The deed described the property as 5 rolling acres, established in the late 1950s upon the grounds of what had once been an expansive, family-owned commercial apple orchard. Most of the original agricultural infrastructure had long since weathered away, leaving behind open fields of wild timothy grass, patches of clover, and a resilient stand of ancient, gnarled Cortland apple trees along the southern boundary line. During our first full spring on the property, after the last winter snows had melted and soaked into the earth, I began the long task of clearing decades of overgrown brush and wild blackberry brambles behind an old cedar tool shed. The ground in that corner of the yard possessed a subtle rectangular depression, scarcely noticeable unless you were walking directly across it. Assuming it was merely a sunken drainage ditch or the forgotten foundation of an old chicken coop, I took a heavy trenching spade and began peeling back the dense layer of sod and roots. About 18 inches down, through rich, dark loam that smelled of early spring earth, the tip of my spade struck something with a solid, hollow resonance. I brushed aside the damp dirt with a gloved hand, expecting to find a slab of bedrock or a discarded concrete foundation footer. Instead, the blade had scraped against thick, tightly fitted planks of tongue and groove white oak, preserved remarkably well beneath the cool soil. Over the next 3 afternoons, working at an unhurried pace under the warm afternoon sun, I carefully unearthed the perimeter. It revealed a heavy, double paneled wooden cellar door set within a meticulously laid fieldstone frame. The iron strap hinges were coated in a thick, velvety layer of dark red rust, and the drop latch was held fast by a hand forged iron pin. With the careful application of penetrating oil and gentle pressure from a pry bar, the metal mechanism shifted with a deep, mechanical clunk, breaking a seal that had held undisturbed for generations. I lifted the heavy oak door back, letting it rest against the grass. A rush of cool, clean air rose from the opening. It carried no scent of decay or stagnant moisture. Rather, it smelled of dry limestone, aged pine timber, dried herbs, and the sweet, lingering essence of cold stone. Taking a brass flashlight, I stepped down a flight of 4 hand-chiseled limestone steps into a rectangular, subterranean room carved directly into the bedrock shelf beneath the orchard. The root cellar was pristine. Along the north wall stood 3 tiers of rough-sawn hemlock shelving, built with sturdy, square-headed nails. Arranged neatly along these shelves were dozens of heavy, amber glass canning jars, their metal bales and wax seals completely intact. Inside, preserved in golden syrup and undisturbed dark layers, were preserved spiced apples, wild blackberries, and pickled root vegetables from harvests nearly a century past. On a sturdy work table in the corner sat a flat, wooden carpenter's chest. Inside its velvet-lined compartments lay a brass surveyor's compass, a set of hand-drawn property maps rendered on linen paper, and a thick, leather-bound farm ledger. The handwriting inside was executed in meticulous, flowing, fountain pen script, recording the daily rhythms of orchard life throughout the 1920s. Page after page cataloged simple, grounding milestones. October 14th, 1924. First hard frost across the lower hollow. Gathered 50 barrels of Northern Spy apples. Chimney cleaned and drawing well. November 3rd, 1926. Pressed 12 gallons of sweet cider with cinnamon and clove. Cellar stocked for the coming snows. All is peaceful. Tucked into the back of the ledger was a loose, folded sheet of parchment titled simply, Recipe for Winter Warming. It listed a blend of dried orchard peel, crushed allspice, whole nutmeg, and local honey, written with the careful precision of someone who found genuine comfort in the craft of keeping a home warm against the bitter cold. Standing in that quiet room, beneath the gentle insulation of the earth, a deep sense of calm settled over me. There was no feeling of intrusion, only the quiet preservation of an ordinary, beautiful life lived with intention. The cellar was not a forgotten tomb. It was a deliberate sanctuary created to protect the fruits of an honest season's labor. We decided immediately that we would not fill the space in or convert it into modern storage. Over the coming weeks, I carefully cleaned the limestone masonry, treated the original oak doors with linseed oil to protect them from the elements, and placed a small, battery-operated lantern on the center shelf. Now, on quiet autumn evenings, when the wind blows cool through the Cortland trees, I often step down into that stone room, sit on the low wooden bench, and read a few entries from the old ledger, letting the patient, grounded history of the land bring a sense of quiet stillness to the end of the day. Story 3. The 3 a.m. Diner on Route 9. There is a unique and restorative tranquility that exists exclusively inside all-night roadside diners during the hours between midnight and sunrise. When I was completing my undergraduate studies in the mid-2000s, I worked the graveyard shift, 11 at night until 7 in the morning, at a stainless steel, classic modular diner situated along a quiet stretch of State Route 9, tucked neatly between a vast state forest and an active freight rail line. During the daytime, the diner was a bustling, clattering hub of delivery drivers, weekend travelers, and local highway workers. But as the clock turned past midnight, the world outside fell away, and the atmosphere inside underwent a complete transformation. The overhead fluorescent fixtures were turned down, leaving the dining room illuminated by the soft, warm amber glow of tabletop lanterns and the gentle neon trim reflecting off the polished chrome walls. The soundscape shifted from the loud commotion of service to a soothing, rhythmic cadence. The deep, continuous hum of the commercial reach in coolers, the gentle hiss of water simmering in the coffee urns, and the distant, low rumble of midnight freight trains rolling through the mountain pass miles away. My duties during those hours were uncomplicated and steady. I would wipe down the laminate counter until it shone, restock the sugar dispensers, and brew fresh pots of dark roast and herbal teas. The solitude was never lonely. It felt like being the caretaker of a warm, floating island of light in the middle of a dark, sleeping countryside. Every Thursday morning, at precisely 20 past 3, the chime above the front door would ring with a soft, single strike. Without fail, an older gentleman named Arthur would step inside. He was a retired commercial driver in his late 70s, always dressed in a clean, ironed chambray shirt, a heavy wool cardigan, and a faded canvas cap. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, bringing in with him a subtle draft of cool night air and pine. Arthur always chose the same booth, the one furthest from the entrance, nestled in the corner where the panoramic glass window looked out over the quiet asphalt parking lot and the dark wall of pines beyond. He never ordered heavy meals. When I walked over with a menu, he would smile warmly, tip his cap, and say the same words every week. Just a pot of hot water, a few bags of chamomile, and a side of honey, please. I would bring out a ceramic teapot, a clean white mug, and a small glass dish of clover honey. We rarely engaged in extended conversations, and that unspoken understanding was the greatest comfort of his visits. Arthur was a man who understood the profound value of comfortable silence. From his canvas satchel, he would retrieve a worn, hardbound sketchbook and a collection of soft graphite pencils. As he sipped his tea, letting the steam rise toward the window pane, he would sketch. Sometimes he drew the silhouettes of the old industrial water towers standing along the distant railway. Other times, he captured the intricate reflections of neon light bouncing across wet pavement after a passing rain shower. His hand moved across the textured paper with steady, rhythmic strokes, the faint rasp of lead against the page blending seamlessly with the quiet ambience of the room. For nearly 2 hours, we shared that warm, quiet space. I would sit on a stool behind the counter, reading textbooks, or simply watching the darkness outside soften into the deep indigo that precedes the dawn. There was an immense sense of security in that room, two people existing in peaceful parallel, both finding comfort in the shelter of the night while the rest of the county slept undisturbed. Around 5 in the morning, as the first early commuters began to pull into the parking lot and the sky above the tree line turned a pale, misty lavender, Arthur would carefully pack his pencils away. He would place a crisp $5 bill beneath his empty saucer, stand up, give a polite, respectful nod toward the counter, and step back out into the crisp morning air. I worked that shift for 3 years, and those quiet hours with Arthur taught me something vital about the world. That peace is not something you have to search far to find. Sometimes it is simply a matter of finding a warm corner of the world, slowing your breathing, and allowing the quiet moments to unfold without trying to rush them along. Story 4: The Archive on Server 404. In the world of multiplayer sandbox games, longevity is rare. Most shared servers experience a burst of intense creativity for a few months before activity gradually fades. Players move on to new projects, and the host machine is eventually shut down. But there are rare exceptions, quiet, enduring digital realms that remain running continuously in the background of life for years, accumulating history layer by layer like sedimentary rock. I spent nearly 4 years playing on a semi private survival server that had been hosted continuously since the summer of 2012. The server had no economy plugins, no competitive factions, and no resets. It was simply an infinite world governed by pure vanilla mechanics. By 2018, most of the active community had drifted away due to college, careers, and changing routines, but the administrator kept the world online, running quietly on a dedicated server in an attic across the country. One rainy evening, unable to find sleep, I logged into the empty world. Spawn was a sprawling, chaotic museum of early building styles: cobblestone castles, wooden bridges spanning rivers, and wheat farms lit by rows of simple torches. But I wanted to explore beyond the familiar landmarks. I gathered a stack of spruce wood, crafted a simple boat, and set off along the northern ocean line, traveling past the 10,000 coordinate mark where player builds ceased to appear on the horizon. For over an hour, the journey was defined by pure meditative rhythm: the steady paddle of the wooden boat, the gentle lap of pixelated water against the hull, and the slow transit of the moon across the dark blue skybox created a calming, hypnotic pace. Eventually, after crossing thousands of blocks of deep ocean, the horizon opened up into a vast, untouched landscape of towering ice spikes rising from frozen plains, illuminated by the pale, soft glow of the Northern Lights shader I had enabled. Tucked into a natural crescent valley between three massive spires of packed ice stood a grand, low profile structure. It was constructed with remarkable restraint, using dark sea prismarine, smooth sandstone, and polished basalt pillars that blended seamlessly into the surrounding frozen tundra. Large floor to ceiling windows made of tinted glass looked out directly over the quiet expanse of the snowfield. I stepped through the unlatched oak doors and found myself inside an immense, multi story library. Soft sea lanterns were hidden beneath dark oak slabs, casting a gentle, uniform illumination across hundreds of filled bookshelves. In the center of the hall, resting upon carved lecterns, were dozens of written in game books, arranged chronologically. As I opened the first volume, I realized I had stumbled upon a collaborative diary kept by a group of 5 close friends who had played on the server together from their middle school years in 2012 through their high school graduation in 2017. The entries were ordinary, heartfelt, and profoundly human. They recorded late night building sessions during winter breaks, shared inside jokes about lost mining expeditions, cataloged recipes for real world snacks they made while playing, and wrote quiet reflections on studying for driver's licenses, dealing with first heartbreaks, and preparing to move away to different universities across the country. The final book, placed on a central lectern made of polished quartz, was dated November 18th, 2017. The entry was brief: "We all move into our dorms this week. We probably won't have much time to log on together anymore, but building this sanctuary in the ice with you all was the highlight of these 5 years. If anyone ever wanders this far north, welcome to our archive. Feel free to stay as long as you like. The fire in the hearth never goes out." Beneath the lectern sat a small hearth of netherrack, burning with a low, silent flame, keeping the center of the wooden library warm. I sat my character down in an armchair next to the fire, looking out the panoramic window at the soft snow falling slowly across the dark ice plains. The digital world was vast, empty, and peaceful. I stayed there for over an hour, listening to the ambient soundtrack loop its quiet piano melodies, before placing a written book of my own on the shelf, simply thanking them for leaving a warm refuge in the cold, and logging off into the quiet of the night. Story 5: The Glassblowers Mountain Studio. High in the western ridges of the Blue Ridge Mountains, branching off from an unpaved Forest Service road, sits a narrow gravel lane that leads to a secluded cluster of stone and timber workshops constructed during the late 1960s. A user on Reddit shared an account of spending 3 weeks in early winter house sitting and maintaining the studio of an elderly glass artist who had traveled south for the cold season. The studio was built directly into the granite slope of the mountain, featuring massive timber post and beam construction and two-story south-facing windows that looked out over a deep, untouched gorge filled with mountain laurel, bare oaks, and hemlock stands. When the sun dipped behind the western ridge around 4 in the afternoon, the mountain air would cool rapidly, coating the exterior of the high glass panes in intricate, feathery patterns of frost. The primary responsibility during the stay was not complicated, but it required a steady, grounding routine. The studio had no central electrical heating. The sole source of warmth for the living quarters in the loft above was a massive, hand built soapstone wood stove positioned in the center of the flagstone ground floor. Soapstone absorbs heat slowly and releases it steadily over dozens of hours, creating an even, dry warmth that fills every corner of a room without the harsh dryness of forced air. Every evening around dusk, the narrator would begin the process of preparing the hearth for the night. They would walk out to the covered woodshed behind the workshop, gathering seasoned splits of white oak, black cherry, and aromatic red cedar. Bringing the wood inside in a heavy canvas carrier, the scent of dried moss and forest timber would fill the warm room. The studio itself was an incredible space of reflected light. Lining the perimeter walls, resting upon rough cedar shelves, and hanging from forged iron brackets across the ceiling were hundreds of pieces of hand blown glass, delicate lanterns, cobalt blue globes, clear prism bottles, and thick amber glass vessels. Once the kindling caught and the oak logs began to burn with a deep orange coal bed, the firelight would shine through the glass array. The room became transformed into a slow, moving landscape of color. Warm amber, deep sapphire, emerald green, and pale rose light reflected across the gray flagstone floor and danced softly along the high cedar rafters. With no internet connection, no television screen, and a telephone that only rang for essential service calls, the evening hours stretched out into a peaceful expanse of time. The narrator described the simple, deeply relaxing ritual of heating a kettle of water on the flat iron top of the wood stove, brewing a pot of loose leaf peppermint and chamomile tea, and sitting in a deep leather armchair by the fire. The only sounds in the entire valley were the gentle, rhythmic ticking of a brass pendulum wall clock, the occasional soft crackle of a seasoned oak log shifting within the hearth, and the distant, muffled sigh of mountain wind brushing across the timber roof. The narrator noted that after 3 days in the studio, the constant underlying mental noise of modern life simply dissolved. Sleep came effortlessly by 9 or 10 each evening, a deep, uninterrupted rest cocooned beneath heavy wool blankets in the loft, while the soapstone stove below radiated a steady, comforting warmth into the night. It remains a powerful testament to the restorative power of simplicity, that when you quiet the environment around you, find warmth in honest materials, and let the night proceed without hurry, the mind naturally returns to a state of absolute, effortless peace. Story 6: The Noisy Neighbor. When I first moved into my apartment, I was thrilled with the place itself. Good light, decent water pressure, a landlord who actually answered the phone, but there was one thing nobody had warned me about. The guy next door practiced drums every evening, right around 7 o'clock, like clockwork. It wasn't loud in any dramatic sense. No shouting, no music blasting through the walls, just the steady, insistent thump of a bass drum working its way through the drywall. A rhythm I could feel more than hear, right as I was trying to unwind after a long shift. For the first couple of weeks, I told myself it was fine. New building, new neighbor, everybody deserves a little grace while you figure each other out. But after a particularly draining night at work, coming home to that same low, relentless thump was the last straw. I stood outside my own door for a solid minute, working up the nerve, before finally crossing the hall and knocking on his. He opened it looking immediately, almost comically embarrassed, drumsticks still loosely in one hand, like he'd forgotten he was holding them. Before I could even get a full sentence out, he said, "Is it the drums? I'm so sorry. I completely lose track of time when I'm playing." That took most of the wind out of my irritation. I told him it was mostly fine. Just maybe a little later in the evening than I'd like on some nights, especially after long shifts. He nodded, thoughtful rather than defensive, and asked what actually worked for my schedule instead of just apologizing and letting it happen again the next day. We ended up agreeing on a rough window. Nothing after 6:30 on weeknights, and he even offered, unprompted, to put down a thick rug and some foam padding under the kit to cut down on the bass traveling through the floor and walls. I hadn't even asked for that. He just seemed to want to actually fix it, not just apologize for it. A week later, the sound really was barely noticeable, just a faint, muffled rhythm if I pressed my ear to the wall out of curiosity. A week after that, I found a small note slipped under my door, a hand drawn cartoon of a drum kit wearing oversized headphones with, "Thanks for being cool about it," scrawled underneath in slightly messy handwriting. We nod at each other in the hallway now, the easy kind of nod between people who've settled something without it turning into a whole ordeal. Sometimes on Saturday afternoons, I can hear him playing something slow and unhurried, brushes instead of sticks, barely audible through the wall, and honestly, it's become one of my favorite sounds in the building. Funny how a thing that used to irritate me so much turned into something I'd almost miss if it stopped. A few weeks after the note, he knocked on my door for the first time, holding two mismatched mugs of tea and looking slightly awkward about the whole thing. He said he'd been meaning to properly introduce himself for a while and figured tea was a safer icebreaker than an apology this time. We ended up talking on my doorstep for almost half an hour, about nothing in particular: his job, my job, how neither of us had really expected to end up in this building, in this city, doing what we were doing. It turned out he'd played drums since he was 12, taught himself mostly, using an old practice pad and a metronome he still keeps on top of the kit for old time's sake, even though he barely needs it anymore. He told me, almost sheepishly, that the 7 o'clock slot wasn't random. It was the only hour of the day that felt like his, before the rest of his evening got swallowed up by emails and errands and everything else. I told him I understood that more than he probably realized. We didn't solve anything else that evening. We didn't need to. We just stood in the hallway a while longer, mugs cooling in our hands, two neighbors who'd started as an inconvenience to each other and ended up, almost by accident, as something closer to friends. Story 7: Grandma's Garden Notebook. After my grandmother passed, we spent a long weekend clearing out her house. The kind of weekend that's equal parts grief and logistics, where you're crying over a coffee mug one minute and arguing about who's taking the recliner the next. Most of what we found was ordinary. Old furniture nobody quite wanted, but nobody could throw out either. Boxes of photographs, half of them unlabeled, faces we half recognized from decades before we were born. Drawers full of receipts and warranty cards for appliances that had died years ago. It was in the garden shed, tucked behind a shelf of chipped clay pots and a coil of old hose, that I found a spiral notebook with a cracked plastic cover, the kind you'd buy for $1 at any drugstore. Inside, in her careful, slightly slanted handwriting, were decades of notes about her garden. Which years the tomatoes had done well and which years they hadn't. Which spring frost had killed the peppers 3 years running before she finally learned to wait an extra 2 weeks to plant them. A little hand drawn sketch of where she'd planted the roses back in 1994, with an arrow and a note reading, "Moved these, too much shade." Scattered throughout, tucked between the gardening notes, almost like she couldn't help herself, were small observations that had nothing to do with gardening at all. Warm today, sat outside longer than planned. Robin's back again, third year in a row. Sometimes just 2 words. Good day. I sat on the dusty floor of that shed for almost an hour, knees pulled up, reading it front to back while the rest of the family called my name from inside the house, growing steadily more impatient. I didn't answer for a while. I couldn't have explained why it felt so important in that moment, only that it did. Further into the notebook, past the gardening years, the entries changed a little. The handwriting got shakier in places, the notes a little shorter, a little less frequent, though the pattern of small observations continued right up until what must have been near the end. One page simply read, "Tomatoes late this year. Don't mind. Sat outside anyway." Another, a few pages later, just, "Cold today. Watched the birds from the window instead." I found myself crying over that one, sitting alone in the shed while the rest of the family loaded boxes into a truck outside. It wasn't sad exactly. Not entirely. It was more the quiet, ordinary honesty of it. A woman who kept gardening, kept noticing the world around her, even as the world got smaller and colder and harder to get outside into. She never stopped writing it down. She just adjusted what a good day meant and kept going. This spring, I planted her tomatoes in almost the same spot she always used, going by her notes on sun and shade in which corner of the yard warmed up first. They're doing reasonably well so far, a little scraggly, but coming along. I started my own notebook, too, an ordinary spiral one, nothing special. And some evenings, after watering, I catch myself sitting outside a little longer than I planned to, watching the light change over the fence line. I've started keeping her notebook on the shelf above my own desk, not tucked away in a box with everything else. Some mornings before work, I flip it open to a random page, just to read one line of hers before I read one of mine. It feels like a small, quiet way of gardening alongside her, even now, just to write it down, the way she did. Warm today. Sat outside longer than planned. Good day. Story 8. The Library Return. I work at a small public library in a town where most people know each other, or at least recognize each other by sight, even if they couldn't tell you a name. It's the kind of place where the same faces show up week after week, and you start to notice when someone's routine changes, when the usual Tuesday afternoon regular doesn't show up for a few weeks, or when someone new starts coming in around the same time every day. A few months ago, a woman came in to return a stack of books that had clearly been overdue for a long time. You could tell just by looking at them. A faint layer of dust along the top edges, the kind that only settles in after months of sitting untouched on a shelf somewhere, not being read, just being felt guilty about. She apologized before she even set the stack down on the counter, already reaching for her wallet, asking how much she owed before I'd even had a chance to check. I pulled up her account in the system, half expecting a fairly substantial fine given how overdue the books clearly were. As it turned out, The fees had actually been forgiven months earlier during a Fresh Start program the library ran to wipe out old, overdue fines, specifically so people wouldn't feel too embarrassed or guilty to come back through the door. I told her the balance was zero. She looked at me like she thought I might be joking, and when I confirmed it, she looked genuinely relieved, almost emotional about it. The kind of relief that comes from carrying around a small worry for far longer than it probably deserved. She admitted she'd been putting off coming in for over a year, convinced she owed some substantial, embarrassing amount, when in reality, she'd been just one single renewal away from being completely fine the entire time. She left that day with a new stack of books tucked under her arm, and she's been a regular ever since, showing up every couple of weeks, always with a friendly wave when she comes through the door. Last month, she brought in a plate of banana bread for the staff. Just because, she said, setting it down on the front desk almost shyly. It sat in our break room for the rest of the week, and it was gone well before closing time on the first day. She's become something of a fixture now, in the same quiet way the old man from the coffee shop story is a fixture there. She's started volunteering on Thursday afternoons, helping shelve returns and reading to the small cluster of toddlers who show up for story hour. Patient in a way that suggests she's done a version of this before, in some other life or another library entirely. A few weeks ago, she told me, almost in passing while sorting a cart of picture books, that she'd actually driven past the library at least a dozen times during that year she stayed away, slowing down each time, never quite pulling into the lot. She said she used to imagine the fine had grown into hundreds of dollars by then, an amount so embarrassing she'd rather just avoid the whole building entirely than face it. I told her I was glad she finally came in anyway. She just smiled and went back to sorting the cart, the kind of smile that didn't need any more words attached to it. Sometimes the smallest bit of forgiveness, a policy nobody even remembers agreeing to, a fine quietly wiped from a system, is all it takes to bring someone back through a door they'd convinced themselves was closed to them. Story 10: The Wedding Seating Chart. My cousin's wedding almost had a seating chart disaster. The kind of thing that sounds small until you're the one lying awake at 2 in the morning trying to solve it. Two branches of the family hadn't spoken in years over an old disagreement that, honestly, nobody in the current generation could even fully explain anymore. Something about a family business, an inheritance, an argument passed down secondhand until the details had blurred, but the tension hadn't. And somehow, through some combination of software glitch and last minute guest list changes, both sides had ended up assigned to the exact same table. My cousin was stressed about it for weeks leading up to the big day. She kept pulling up the seating chart on her laptop late at night, staring at it like the names might rearrange themselves if she looked hard enough. She didn't want to start her marriage with a family blow-up in the middle of the reception, cake half eaten, everyone pretending not to notice the tension radiating from table 12. In the end, her solution was almost embarrassingly simple. She didn't rearrange the whole chart, didn't spend hours agonizing over who could sit where without causing a diplomatic incident. She just added one more person to that particular table: her college roommate, warm and funny and endlessly easy to talk to. The kind of person who could make small talk with a brick wall and somehow make the wall feel interesting. She asked her quietly beforehand, over coffee, to just keep the conversation moving if things got tense, without making it obvious that's what she was doing. On the actual day, it barely came up at all. The roommate kept things light from the moment everyone sat down, asking a lot of questions, telling a few good stories of her own, steering things gently whenever the conversation drifted anywhere near old, sore subjects. By the time the cake was cut and everyone drifted toward the dance floor, The two sides of the family were at least talking to each other, even laughing a little, something that hadn't happened in years. Nobody solved the old disagreement that night. The underlying tension is probably still there, buried somewhere, waiting for the next family gathering to surface again in some smaller way. But nobody needed to solve it that particular evening. Later that night, well after the cake had been cut and most of the older relatives had said their goodbyes, my cousin found me by the drinks table and asked, a little nervously, how table 12 had gone. I told her honestly, better than expected, maybe even better than most of the other tables, where conversation had occasionally lagged into the usual small talk about traffic and weather. She let out a long breath and admitted she'd been checking on that table more than any other all evening, glancing over every few minutes between dances, half expecting to see someone storming off toward the parking lot. Instead, by the time the night wound down, she saw her aunt and her uncle in law, two people who hadn't exchanged more than a stiff nod in years, laughing together over something on someone's phone, her roommate sitting between them with the satisfied look of someone who'd quietly done exactly what she'd been asked to do. My cousin still keeps a photo from that table on her fridge, actually. A candid, slightly blurry shot someone took mid laugh, nobody looking at the camera. She says it reminds her that some things don't need a grand gesture to fix. Sometimes they just need one good conversationalist and a slice of cake. Sometimes you don't fix the whole problem. You just add one warm, steady person to the table and let the evening do the rest of the work for you. Story 11. The Secondhand Piano. We bought a secondhand piano last year, mostly for our daughter, who'd been begging for lessons for what felt like most of that year, ever since a friend at school had shown her a few notes on one during a birthday party. It came from an elderly woman a few streets over, who was moving into a smaller place and simply didn't have room for it anymore. A sturdy old upright, with a slightly worn finish and a sound that was warm rather than perfect. When the movers brought it into our living room, maneuvering it carefully through the front door with a level of care that suggested it wasn't the first piano they'd handled, we found a small note folded and taped to the underside of the keyboard cover. Easy to miss if you weren't looking. It was from the woman who'd owned it, her handwriting a little shaky but careful, explaining that the piano had belonged to her late husband, who'd played it every single evening after dinner for almost 50 years, without fail, right up until he couldn't anymore. She wrote that she wasn't ready to sell it to just any stranger, not really, but that she was glad it was going somewhere it would be played again, rather than sitting silent in some storage unit gathering dust. She said she hoped whoever found the note would think of him sometimes, just for a moment, whenever they sat down to play. Not out of obligation, just as a small, quiet acknowledgement that the piano had a whole life before it arrived in our living room. My daughter doesn't know the full story yet. She's still working through simple scales, slow and a little clumsy, her fingers not quite finding the right keys every time, filling the house most evenings after dinner with careful, imperfect music that somehow still manages to sound lovely in its own uneven way. A few months after we brought the piano home, I finally worked up the nerve to knock on the woman's door, a small gift in hand. Nothing much, just a box of tea and a card thanking her for the note, and for trusting us with something that clearly meant so much to her. She invited me in for a few minutes, her new apartment small but warm, a single framed photo of her and her husband on the side table, him seated at what I now recognized as our piano, decades younger, mid laugh at something just out of frame. She asked, almost shyly, how the piano was settling in, and I told her about our daughter's scales, imperfect and slow but improving, filling the house every evening after dinner. Her eyes went a little glassy at that, though she waved it off quickly, saying only that he would have liked knowing it was being played badly by an 8-year-old far more than he'd have liked it sitting silent and perfect in some stranger's parlor. Before I left, she asked if she could come hear our daughter play sometime, once she'd learned something proper, and I told her she'd always be welcome. I think about that visit almost as often as the note itself now, an old piano, and the quiet, unexpected thread it stitched between two houses that otherwise would never have known each other at all. I think about that note more often than I probably should, usually in the quiet moments right after she finishes practicing and the house goes still again. Somewhere across town, an old piano's second life is just beginning, note by careful note, in a house that isn't so very different, in the end, from the one it came from. That's where we'll leave it for tonight. If you're still awake, that's perfectly all right. Just close your eyes, let the last of these stories settle quietly somewhere in the back of your mind, and let everything else wait until morning. Thank you for spending this hour with me. If it helped you drift off, I'll see you again next time. Sleep well.